5 FIBO world records. We are not talking about simple career highlights or a few trophies gathered over a decade of international play. These were 5 distinct officially sanctioned FIA world benchmarks, shattered in a single night during the very first game Caitlin Clark ever played for the United States senior national team. Take a second to let that reality set in. Most elite athletes spend their entire lives grinding through youth systems and developmental ranks, fighting through endless qualifying rounds just to catch a glimpse of a senior national roster spot. The few who actually make the cut usually need a massive adjustment period to learn new systems, build chemistry, and decode complex defenses, all while carrying the immense pressure of representing their entire nation on the most prestigious stage in women's basketball. There is always a learning curve, a transition phase where even the most gifted player on the court has to navigate new waters. Clark did not look for her footing. She absolutely demolished the foundation. Yet, the response from the Team USA coaching staff was to minimize her impact, move her away from the ball, shuffle the rotation. They told every journalist at the podium that this was purely a team-centric program, emphasizing that everyone on the roster was a seasoned professional. They insisted that balancing minutes and spreading touches was the only way to build a winning culture. What you are about to see is the account of how that specific philosophy began to crack before completely imploding. It is the story of a leadership group that looked directly at historical evidence and chose to follow their own dogma instead. It features a player who never once vented her frustration publicly or dropped a single passive-aggressive hint to the media. She remained the ultimate professional on camera, even while the game tape revealed she was operating on a different level with every single possession. And most crucially, it is the tale of the fill-in coach who walked into the arena mid-tournament, evaluated the same data everyone else had been ignoring, and made one tactical shift that triggered a 55-point margin of victory. He then stood before the global media and explained exactly what had been failing before he took charge. This isn't some fan theory or a narrative built on social media trends. This is the raw truth of what happened behind the scenes during Team USA's FIA qualifying run. We explore the current impact on the game and why the shockwaves from that tournament are still rattling women's basketball globally. Let's dive in. When Clark first stepped onto the hardwood against Senegal, the atmosphere was already thick with tension. One group argued she had been systematically ignored and underused by the national program for way too long. The other side countered that the senior national team held a different standard entirely, claiming that roster spots were earned through years of international service and a proven history at the highest levels. They believed Clark still had to pay her dues before the organization would ever hand her the keys to the offense. What no one expected was for her to make both sides of that debate completely irrelevant in the span of one game. 5 FIA world records. Not just 5 decent stat lines or ranking high in a few categories. 5 official world records broken during a debut, while the entire global basketball community watched with a level of scrutiny unlike anything else in the sport. To understand the weight of this, you have to realize what FIA records actually represent. These aren't just numbers from a domestic league. These are the gold standards set over decades of international play by every top-tier women's program on the planet. The icons who held these records before Clark were the most celebrated legends the international game has ever seen. Some of those milestones had remained untouched for years. Clark walked into her first appearance and completely dismantled them, passing, shooting efficiency, pure statistical dominance at a level that international women's basketball had never witnessed in a single game. When you consider the context, her first game at the senior level with 0 transition time, the scale of what she did to Senegal becomes almost impossible to process through a normal basketball lens. This wasn't just a lucky shooting night where the ball kept falling regardless of the defense. It wasn't a case of a weak opponent giving up wide-open looks to pad the numbers. This was one player proving she is the most dangerous offensive engine on the planet, accomplishing it in a high-stakes setting where every move was measured against the entire history of the sport. The basketball world should have seen the writing on the wall. We'd just witnessed a feat so rare, the game had no historical blueprint for it. On that court stood a phenom who just demolished every existing metric, proving she lived in a stratosphere far above everyone else in the arena. The next step was painfully clear. Construct the entire scheme around that spark. Turn Clark into the primary motor, letting her vision dictate the flow while her teammates feasted on the chaos she created. Yet, that reality never materialized. Kara Lawson entered the USA qualifying rounds, anchored to a rigid strategic playbook she refused to deviate from. Spread the wealth across the board. Carve up the minutes equally among a locker room stacked with seasoned veterans. A collective brand where no individual name outshines the crest. On paper, such a philosophy carries a lot of weight. Success on the global stage usually hinges on deep rotations, tight bonds, and perfectly synchronized team play. You won't find a single expert disputing those fundamentals in general terms. Having every pro contribute a piece to the puzzle creates a squad far tougher to break than one leaning solely on a lone superstar who, if neutralized, leaves the entire machine stalled. The fatal flaw in that logic, however, is the sheer reality it forces you to overlook. It demands you stare at 5 fresh world records and still conclude that the record breaker needs her minutes slashed just to keep the bench happy. It forces you to watch Clark function as an offensive powerhouse unlike anything the record books have ever seen, then decide that participation trophies for the rest of the squad are the higher priority. You end up worshipping a rigid blueprint while ignoring the actual results screaming at you from the scoreboard. Once the press began digging into Clark's usage after her historic night, Lawson stuck to her scripted narrative. This locker room is packed with top-tier professional starters. This is a collective effort. Everyone gets their moment. Those aren't tactical shifts. They're philosophical platitudes. There's a massive gulf between a vibe and a strategy. A real adjustment tackles what's actually happening on the wood and the logic behind it. It breaks down the exact defensive trap the opposition is laying, how Clark's responsibilities pivot to beat it, and the precise chess move dictating who plays when. A platitude just tells you the staff's feelings on equity, team bonding, and the warm, fuzzy feelings of group cooperation. Once the chasm between those lofty ideals and the actual game score gets wide enough for even a casual viewer to notice, the debate stops being about deep-seated beliefs and starts being about cold, hard production. The turning point for everyone watching from their couches happened when a journalist put Lawson on the spot regarding Clark's offensive involvement. It was a point-blank query with nowhere to hide. Yet, Lawson sidestepped it entirely, nodding to the question before retreating into vague team-first jargon, applauding everyone's supposed desire to trade personal glory for a group win, then promptly moved to the next mic. Watching that media session alongside the highlights of Clark's masterclass created a jarring sense of cognitive dissonance that was hard to ignore. The question was about a singular talent. Lawson's answer was an umbrella that covered the whole squad. That kind of deflection is purely intentional. It's a calculated refusal to address the actual heart of the inquiry. When you repeat that dodge over and over, despite history being rewritten on the court, it's no longer just a media strategy, it's a declaration of war against the obvious. But here is the massive detail the big news networks completely ignored. Without this context, you aren't even seeing half the battlefield in this brewing storm. Right there in that same inner circle, breathing the same air in the same facility, drawing up plans for those same matches, stood Stephanie White, the Indiana Fever's lead strategist, Clark's own pro coach. The same Stephanie White who, throughout the 2025 season, had implemented a scheme that often relegated Clark to the corners, cut her loose from the pick and roll, and favored a much slower, committee-based style of play. Consider the weight of that unified front. You had 2 separate leaders, one handling the national squad and one leading Clark's home team. Both were reading from the exact same script. Both seemed remarkably more at ease when their star wasn't dominating the ball. Both stood side by side, enforcing the same restrictive cage on the game's biggest draw and most lethal scorer at the very same time. That isn't just some random stroke of bad luck. That isn't 2 minds happening to reach the same conclusion through different paths. It was a synchronized effort to ground a high flyer. 2 collaborators were essentially reading from the exact same script across 2 separate stages of one athlete's journey. Hardcore fans weren't just being dramatic when they labeled the strategy an anti-Clark agenda. They were being observant. They pinpointed a recurring, verifiable trend that was dragging performance down in a very public way. The data was crystal clear. The film didn't leave room for debate. If you looked with an unbiased eye, the reality was undeniable. Hoops podcasts and fan forums were suddenly buzzing with one specific, nagging question. Expert analysts weren't debating if the trend was real, it obviously was, but rather if it was deliberate. Was this a deeply held tactical vision shared by both coaching minds? Or was a far more tangled web of motives dictating how Clark was being utilized at every turn? There wasn't a simple explanation, so the game tape continued to tell its own undeniable story. It captured the brilliance of Clark unleashed versus the stagnation that followed whenever they reined her in. Athletic data can be easily skewed. True students of the game know context is king. Efficiency figures mean nothing without looking at possession flow. Collective stats often reveal the system more than the player's actual talent. Real scouting demands diving much deeper than a basic box score. Even so, the events of this qualifier were so glaringly obvious they didn't need complex breakdown. It was plain as day. Whenever Clark took the reins, sprinting down court and dictating the tempo, controlling the pick and roll or feeding teammates, Team USA finally looked like an unstoppable juggernaut. Passing surged and clean looks started falling naturally. They weren't just chucking up prayers as the shot clock died. The dynamic movers thrived by reacting to her elite vision, playing like the world-class pros they truly are. The roster's execution finally caught up to their immense collective potential. But when they parked Clark on the wing or the bench, the offense transformed into a mess. Sets died before the clock hit 10. Ball movement froze because no central leader was reading the floor. Elite stars just stood around waiting for a miracle that this by-committee approach simply couldn't deliver. The difference was jarring. No spreadsheets were required. 30 seconds of footage told you exactly what was gone. The showdown with Puerto Rico made the disparity completely undeniable. Their zone defense cramped the floor a problem. Clark's high-speed style is literally built to dismantle. Rapid-fire passes and transition strikes fueled by her sheer gravity would have punctured those gaps instantly. That explosive edge vanished under the weight of a slow, overly cautious offensive system. Post-match, Clark dropped a hint her longtime followers recognized instantly. Move faster and break the zone sooner. Speed was the only way to beat their scheme. She chose her words with extreme care, desperate to avoid sparking a media firestorm. Her tone was flat, giving tabloids zero ammunition to claim she was attacking her coaches. Yet, those who speak the coded language of frustrated pros saw right through the diplomacy. Anyone familiar with how athletes mask their true feelings understood the weight of her message. Let me take control. Stop restricting me. We all know this collective performs at its peak when I am the primary catalyst. She didn't voice it explicitly or leak her annoyance. There were no shady remarks or public jabs. No cryptic tweets or interview games intended to force the coach's hands. She just clocked in, performed, and put up stats. The tape argued on her behalf every night. Suddenly, this wasn't just about hoop strategy anymore. Approaching the New Zealand game, out of nowhere, something hit that caught everyone off guard. Carol Lawson vanished, and it was not some tactical sideline swap for a single game. There was no stepping away memo or brief explanation, which you would normally expect from an organization like USA Basketball. Not a single official word or press release appeared on any channel the front office controlled. Her spot on the bench was simply empty. No health report, no news drop, nothing. One afternoon, she is at the podium dodging bullets about Clark's role, throwing out vague philosophy answers that sparked more heat than light. Then suddenly, the head coach chair has a new occupant. Even now, the real story behind Lawson leaving that bracket remains locked in a vault. This radio silence is not just a neutral no comment. It is more than just keeping house business private. When every clipboard move is under a microscope by fans nationwide, people do not just shrug at a disappearance. The vacuum fills with noise. The mystery becomes the headline, and anyone with eyes could see exactly what that silence was hinting at. The timing was just too perfect. They yanked Lawson right as the clash between her rigid benching of stars and the messy scoreboard became too toxic to ignore. Her replacement did not waste a heartbeat, naming Clark a starter before the New Zealand tip-off even happened. The shift was instant, absolute, and loud in a way you never see in the middle of a tournament. If a coach ghosts a major stage without a word, and the interim guy immediately flips the script on her most hated decision, a narrative starts writing itself in permanent ink, regardless of what the front office wants. Her absence screams. The pivot screams even louder. The choice to say nothing at all? That speaks volumes too. It might not be the official version, but it is far from nothing. Without a formal statement, the die-hard analysts are going to connect the only dots that make sense. They will conclude that the internal war over how to use Caitlin Clark finally blew the roof off the building. Stepping into that chaos was Nate Tibbetts, the Phoenix Mercury's lead. No warm-up lap, no grace period to find his feet, no long night studying the old playbook before tearing it up. He walked in as the interim and pulled the biggest lever available before the first ball was bounced. He handed Caitlin Clark her starting jersey. There was no board meeting or a long debate about it. No hand-wringing over rotation, equity, or fairness to the rest of the roster. No worrying if jumping Clark over the vets would kill the vibe. Tibbetts looked at the cold facts, the film, the stat sheets, and the undeniable record-breaking proof that had been staring everyone in the face since day one. He chose the logical path. Here was the starting group he threw out against the New Zealand squad. Kelsey Plum, Caitlin Clark, Paige Buchers, Ryan Howard, and Angel Reese. 3 seasoned pros who knew the international grind. Plus 2 phenoms whose specific talents skyrocket when a world-class playmaker is pushing the pace and feeding them right where it hurts the defense. All 5 clicked like clockwork, needing zero explanation at all. This was not some "let's try something crazy" lineup. This was a coach identifying his weapons, knowing their strengths, and building a unit around the one player who makes everyone around her 10 times better. It was a no-brainer. It was immediate. The fact that it took an interim swap mid-series to make it happen exposes a lot about what the old regime was actually focused on. Team USA crushed New Zealand 101-46, a 55-point blowout against a team that was not exactly weak and had been training specifically for this matchup. Clark spearheaded the team's surgical precision and playmaking, unleashing the high-octane flow that defines her signature style. Fast break windows swung wide open at a frequency entirely unseen during the stagnant era of the previous regime. Every pass carried lethal intent. Clean shots emerged from a natural cadence, replacing those frantic, buzzer-beating prayers. Points piled up exactly as they should in a tailor-made ecosystem where players thrive. No solo heroics were required to fix flaws, but rather a unified strike led by a visionary conductor whose instincts ignited scoring lanes for every other player on the hardwood. To the seasoned observer, it felt as though an entirely different roster had materialized out of thin air. Same jerseys, same faces, same exact pool of talent, yet finally utilized in roles that made sense. They sprinted at the elite tempo required to finally unlock the dormant, championship-level ceiling that everyone knew this squad was capable of reaching. However, the tournament's most explosive revelation didn't ignite until the final whistle fell silent. Truth surfaced after the buzzer. Nate Tibbetts approached the microphone to utter a truth that is virtually taboo among the coaching elite. Stripping away the usual diplomatic insulation, he confessed bluntly and directly that the prior strategy had been a total failure without any protective phrasing. He described the rotations as having been shuffled far too often. He admitted the squad lacked sufficient time to bond as a unit. Then, he singled out the starting core, Clark, Plum, Buchers, and Ree to praise them, and Howard specifically, declaring this unit the blueprint for the future while honoring the unique spark each individual brought to the table to ensure the squad functioned at this elite level. Confronted with a query regarding Clark's starting status, Tibbetts refused to hide behind vague, generic team-first platitudes. He skipped the tired sermons about shared sacrifice or whether everyone on the team deserves their turn. Instead, he mapped out the tactical synergy, confirming the lethal advantage Clark provides when the engine is redlining. He delivered the verdict raw, refusing to cushion the blow or shelter fragile egos from the hard truth. He confessed on live television. Standing before a global press corps with every major outlet watching, a head coach essentially admitted his predecessors had fundamentally botched the handling of the Caitlin Clark situation. Such honesty is rare. There exists a sacred, unspoken pact within elite programs across the globe, a code never written down, but understood by every insider. You shield the former staff. You use vague riddles that leave plenty of room for multiple interpretations. You lean on cliches like, "We are exploring various personnel mixes," or "Each matchup dictates a specific strategy." You signal a pivot while carefully avoiding any mention of the wreckage or the person who was actually responsible for it. You never stand before the world's cameras and announce that your franchise cornerstone was being criminally mismanaged. You do not name rosters, pinpoint specific players or adjustments, leaving no doubt about the sheer incompetence of the prior regime. Yet, Tibbetts tore up that script anyway. His words caught fire across the basketball landscape instantly, not just because they were truthful, but because of the raw gravity behind such a public admission. Most raw sports interviews are forgotten within the hour. This went viral because it validated the analytics-driven experts who had been screaming from the rooftops for 1 year. The scheme failed Caitlin Clark. It prioritized a philosophy that viewed her as just another cog, rather than the reactor fueling the entire machine. Now, the tight-knit coaching fraternity has a public, definitive indictment from an active leader echoing those exact, long-held sentiments. The messenger's identity is massive. This was not just a fan. This was not a podcast pundit or a retired legend fishing for social media clicks. This was a current professional leader on the global stage, fully aware of the grenade he was unpinning, choosing to incinerate the former staff's handling of the roster's most lethal weapon. You cannot unring that bell. No follow-up interview or PR spin can dilute the power. It is etched into the history books now. And that official record is the only thing that truly defines what this shift represents for everyone involved. This chapter's data is now set in stone. The receipts are in. Every second of film and every stat line is available for anyone to scrutinize. When Clark orchestrates the floor, dictating the tempo and carving through the lane, she fires passes that dismantle entire defensive units before the opposition can even think about rotating. Her transition game moves at a breakneck speed that paralyzes decision-making. Team USA hit heights never seen before. Look at the assist tallies, the scoring precision, and those massive blowout margins. The sheer rhythm and firepower prove what happens when a team aligns perfectly with its cornerstone talent. But strip that power away, dilute her touches, and lock her out of the primary playmaking role, or kill the tempo just to satisfy some outdated, committee-driven strategy, and the drop-off becomes a glaring red flag for any informed observer. It wasn't just a small drop. It was a glaring, undeniable crash that bled out the scoreboard. This isn't some fairy tale spun by superfans to justify a bias. These are cold, hard facts from the pinnacle of global hoops, etched in stone during a single qualifying run. The coaching circle cannot look away from this reality. The heavy hitters at USA Basketball cannot ignore the truth. The organizations employing the coaches who made these calls cannot unsee it. Most notably, Stephanie White, who manages the Fever and trains Caitlin Clark daily, simply cannot unsee these results. Now, a haunting question looms over every move concerning Clark's future. Will these findings actually spark a change? The proof of her ceiling versus the proof of her being stifled must find its way back into the professional world that messed it up to begin with. Let's be real. Indiana's current roster actually has all the tools for a title run. Aaliyah Boston proved herself in 2025 as the league's most dominant force in the paint. She commands the kind of defensive fear that changes the whole game. Opposing teams are forced to double-team her, leaving teammates wide open for easy looks. Plus, her scoring touch inside makes her an impossible threat to leave alone. That dominance, paired with the right strategy, clears the runway for Clark's perimeter magic. The link between a monster post player and a genius floor general isn't just a theory. It is the absolute heartbeat of high-level modern basketball. Putting Boston and Clark in a system that maximizes their individual superpowers creates a lethal duo that most WNBA squads would find completely unguardable. Sophie Cunningham adds a totally different fire to the mix, bringing a gritty edge and ice-cold shooting that saves the day when the box score stays quiet. Cunningham is exactly the kind of weapon that thrives in a high-octane Clark offense. She is a nightmare for defenders even without touching the ball. She stretches the defense to the breaking point. Her raw intensity levels up the whole roster. Imagine her in a system where Clark finds her in stride. The defense would never recover, and Cunningham would become a specific headache for every opposing coach. We haven't even seen this potential fully tapped at the pro level yet. The massive gulf between Indiana's 2025 highlights and what's possible with this new tempo is a reality that the franchise can no longer afford to ignore. The debate has moved past the theoretical stage. Everything was just talk before that San Juan showdown. Critics called it speculation or scenarios about what might happen if the coaching philosophy shifted. But the answers are in. They are documented and permanent. Under new management, the same star delivered a 55-point win and shattered multiple world records. Compare that to the old, sluggish half-court grind where she practically begged for more speed. Forget the ambiguity. The hard truth is now etched firmly into the scoreboard. The real story behind Carol Lawson's sudden exit from the roster remains locked behind closed doors. Rumors will continue to swirl until we know if internal clashes over Clark's role sparked the fallout. The sequence of events practically begs for scrutiny, especially with the lightning-fast strategy shift and the deafening silence from officials leaving everyone to guess at the truth. Should Lawson eventually reclaim her spot at the helm and tries reviving that restrictive early-season style, the progress Tibbetts sparked turns into a battleground rather than a blueprint. That electric synergy between the starters, the undeniable proof of what happens when this squad finally hits its peak, and the interim leader's blunt admissions about previous failures, all of it is up for debate again. Instead of a settled matter, it becomes a powder keg, exposing exactly where USA Basketball's true loyalties lie. It is not about the polished image they sell to the fans, or their hollow claims of chasing excellence for 2028. It is about what they choose when the pressure is actually on. Conversely, handing Tibbetts the permanent whistle would send a message just as loud. If the powers that be witness the sheer dominance of Nuck, this recent run and decide that this aggressive winning formula is the path forward, Then Clark's position as the centerpiece becomes ironclad, a fact that cannot be quietly undone without a public outcry. Securing the job after a 55-point demolition with Clark fueling the fire isn't just a hire, it's a manifesto. It transcends mere talk, bypassing corporate PR to signal a structural shift in how the Clark era will define this program. This choice carries more weight than any coaching carousel in recent Olympic history. The 2028 Games in Los Angeles offer the biggest stage women's basketball has ever seen on American soil. This is a golden chance to pivot the entire sport's commercial future, riding the massive wave of hype already built around the league. It's about the Clark phenomenon, specifically the sold-out arenas, and the unprecedented ratings the game is currently feasting on. Every single thread of that momentum will collide on that Los Angeles stage in a way the sport has never experienced. That 55-point beatdown with Clark at full throttle was a tantalizing glimpse of what greatness could look like. That is the high-octane team the Los Angeles crowd is desperate to witness. That is the version that will pull in the massive TV audiences, that force networks and big-money sponsors to finally bet big on women's hoops for the long haul. It is the payoff for years of grind, the viral highlights, and the explosive growth of the game. It is for the legion of new fans who followed Clark into the arena and stayed because the action lived up to the hype. But that future hinges entirely on making the right call about who stands on the sidelines. It is about empowering a leader who will build the roster around the glaring evidence we have all just seen. Regressing to that sluggish, overmanaged style from earlier in the qualifiers would be a disaster. Forcing equal shares and slow play while hiding behind team-first cliches and press conferences won't cut it anymore. Ignoring what the scoreboard tells us wouldn't just be a tactical blunder, it would be sabotaging the most vital moment in the history of the sport. The pressure is undeniable, the timing is flawless, and the proof of what actually wins games is sitting right there in the record books. What Tibbets achieved against New Zealand is not some abstract coaching concept anymore. It is a cold, hard fact, a public milestone that stands as a permanent testament for anyone willing to look at the data. Put Clark in the driver's seat and this squad shatters every record in existence. Throttle her back, and the whole machine stalls. The numbers do not care about your traditional philosophies. You either adapt your strategy to the overwhelming evidence, or you choose to fail. Success in San Juan only materialized once the coach blocking progress finally vanished from the floor. Stephanie White continues mentoring Clark as the 2026 Indiana Fever campaign approaches. This upcoming cycle returns to the exact same leadership responsible for both the stagnation and the glory. We saw the corporate PR spin contrasted with the raw, unfiltered truth Tibbets delivered without any hesitation. White was inside that arena. She saw the shift in strategy and heard Tibbets' public testimony regarding the transition. The mystery is whether these findings will reshape the private training sessions within the Fever's own facility. Will the international metrics actually influence the daily coaching style and how each possession is truly executed? Does Clark's 2026 run reflect that explosive, record-shattering entrance against world-class competition? Will we witness that 55-point blowout again, or a return to rigid sets and cryptic coaching complaints? The answer remains a mystery, but the truth is coming soon. When it arrives, the San Juan experience will be the lens for every single critical evaluation. One vital chapter remains unwritten, centered on the decision for the national team's permanent head coaching position. It will be defined by the upcoming 2026 Fever season. It depends on the eventual explanation for why Kara Lawson was missing from the New Zealand game. It will be shaped by the organizational path USA Basketball chooses before the Los Angeles Olympic torch is lit. Every choice moving forward will be weighed against the dramatic events of this qualifying tournament. Every strategist and coach, every basketball titan must now account for the clear evidence of what this specific player can achieve. Total freedom creates an unstoppable offense, while taking that liberty away causes the entire system to fail. Women's basketball has always featured titans. There have always been icons whose individual brilliance far exceeded the tactical systems they inhabited. This moment is unique because the contrast has been recorded with such cold, undeniable precision. An interim leader confirmed on the record exactly what the game film was already screaming. This drama unfolded globally, under the intense gaze of every major sports journalist and analyst in the building. You can spin stories and craft talking points. Coaches can use complex philosophies to avoid answering the most difficult and uncomfortable questions. Those options remain, but the data is permanent, and the footage is etched in history forever. That 55-point lead and 5 world records are now facts that cannot be ignored. Tibbets' podium confession is now permanent. It is all part of the public record now, beyond the reach of any corporate damage control or messaging. The question of the future remains, but the evidence has been presented. It was delivered publicly in a way that the entire basketball world will remember. The next hire for the national team will reveal if the organization actually learned from the San Juan tapes. Pay close attention, because that announcement will carry weight far beyond just a simple coaching change. The Fever's 2026 opener will be the ultimate proof of whether any real growth occurred. That test nears than most realize.